How the avoidant changes when the right person walks away. Let me tell you something hard to hear. Sometimes the only way the avoidant changes is when the right person finally leaves. You were patient, you tried to understand them, you made excuses, you softened your needs just to keep the peace. And somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself that if you could just love them better, they'd finally open up, but that's not how it works. Avoidants often run not because you did something wrong, but because closeness terrifies them. And when you're always available, always understanding, they never have to face that fear. They just stay in their safe shell. You become predictable, forgiving, easy to take for granted. And then one day you stop. You stop chasing. You stop excusing the cold behavior. You stop hoping they'll finally get it. And that moment right there is when everything starts to shift. Because now, for the first time, the avoidant is forced to feel the weight of real loss. Not the kind they imagined in their head, but actual felt undeniable loss of someone who truly cared. They realize you weren't the problem. Your love wasn't pressure. Your presence wasn't a threat. It was safe. It was rare. And now it's gone. And if they're ever going to grow, if they're ever going to show up differently in their next relationship, or maybe even come back changed, it won't be because you held on tighter. It'll be because you let go. Sometimes walking away is the love story, not for them, but for you. When someone has an avoidant attachment style, their entire nervous system is wired to perceive closeness a threat. They crave connection like anyone else, but when it starts to feel too emotionally intense or consistent, they pull back. It's not logical and it's not personal. It's protective. They've likely learned somewhere along the line that vulnerability leads to pain, disappointment, or loss of control. So they build walls. Emotional distance becomes their safety net. The problem is when they're in a relationship with someone who is deeply available, someone who shows up, communicates, offers warmth and consistency, they don't necessarily feel inspired to grow. They feel comfortable staying the same. Why? Because there's no urgency to face their fears. The other person, often empathetic, loving, and patient, keeps showing up despite being pushed away. The avoidant doesn't have to confront the cost of their behavior. They get all the benefits of love and connection without the responsibility of emotional vulnerability. And when that happens, they stagnate, don't just get a reply. They don't reflect. They don't realize they're withholding. In fact, they may even start to see the other person's desire for closeness too much, when in reality, it's a completely reasonable need. When someone always stays, even when their emotional needs aren't being met, it sends a message, intentionally or not, that the avoidant keep withdrawing without consequence. So they do, not because they're cruel, not because they don't care, because nothing is pushing them to change. They've adapted to relationships where emotional closeness felt unsafe, and now they're in one where it is safe, but it feels unfamiliar. So instead of leaning in, they lean out. This is why the avoidant often only begins to change when the dynamic shifts. As long as the other person continues to make emotional sacrifices to keep the peace, the avoidant remains untouched by the impact of their own detachment. The environment doesn't challenge them to evolve. There's no mirror being held up, no reason to reconsider their patterns. The tragic irony is, the more someone tries to prove their love by staying, by being endlessly understanding, the more invisible their emotional needs become. And the avoidant learns unconsciously that they keep choosing comfort over connection. Growth rarely happens in comfort. It happens when the avoidant feels something they've been trying to avoid all along, the pain of losing someone they didn't believe would ever leave. Only then do they start to realize that their defenses haven't been protecting them. They've been pushing away the very thing they wanted. When someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls away, it's easy to internalize their behavior and assume that you're doing something wrong. You might start questioning yourself. Was I too needy, too emotional? Did I come on too strong? But the truth is, their distance is rarely about you. It's about their own relationship with emotional intimacy and the story they've learned to tell themselves about closeness. For the avoidant, vulnerability doesn't feel safe. It feels like exposure. It feels like a loss of control. And often it feels like a trap. At some point in their life, they may have learned, consciously or not, that depending on someone else was dangerous. Maybe love was inconsistent or conditional. Maybe emotional needs weren't met or were even criticized. So they did what anyone would do to survive emotionally. They adapted. They learned to self-soothe, to rely on themselves, to not get too close. Over time, they associated closeness with pain or pressure. And that belief doesn't just disappear when they meet someone kind, consistent, and emotionally available. In fact, that kind of love can trigger their deepest fears, not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. When you express your needs to someone with an avoidant style, they may interpret it as a demand, even if you're being gentle and honest. Your desire to connect, to be reassured, to feel emotionally safe. Those are basic human needs. But to an avoidant, that level of intimacy can feel overwhelming. They don't always understand the difference between a healthy request for connection and a perceived threat to their independence. So instead of leaning in, they create space. Instead of talking about what's going on inside, they shut down or retreat. And when that happens, it's easy to take it personally. But it isn't personal. It's protective. What's happening beneath the surface is that the avoidant is experiencing a conflict. They want love, but they fear what comes with letting someone in too deeply. And the more emotionally attuned you are, the more that contrast is brought to light. Your ability to be present actually highlights their discomfort with presence. Your emotional availability exposes their struggle to reciprocate, not because they don't care, but because they're still fighting ghosts from the past. This is why it's so important to remember that someone pulling away isn't always a reflection of your worth. Often, it's a reflection of their fear, their patterns, their unresolved history, and until they choose to confront it, love, no matter how real, will always feel like something to run from. In relationships where one person has an avoidant attachment style, a dynamic can emerge that feels strangely stable, but in a way that slowly erodes the emotional health of the other person. The more consistently you stay, even when your needs go unmet, the more you teach the avoidant that there's no real consequence to their emotional withdrawal. You don't mean to do it. You think you're being patient, understanding, or loving. But over time, this dynamic doesn't encourage connection, it enables disconnection. When someone regularly distances themselves, avoids deep conversations, or shuts down when things get too emotional, it chips away at intimacy. And if you're someone who values closeness, you might start to make compromises just to maintain the relationship. You learn to express less. You learn to tolerate silence. You start convincing yourself that your emotional needs are too much, or that if you could just be more easygoing, they'd stop pulling away. So you shrink, you adapt, you accept breadcrumbs of attention and tell yourself it's a feast. But love that demands the silencing of your own needs isn't sustainable. The more you stay in a space where you are not emotionally fed, the more disconnected you become from your own sense of value. And while the avoidant might feel relief in your quietness, they're not being called into growth. They're not being asked to meet you at a deeper level, because from their perspective, you're okay with the way things are. There's no visible discomfort, no healthy friction. Just one person doing the emotional labor of keeping the relationship alive and the other person avoiding anything that feels too intense. It's a slow erosion. At first, it feels like compromise. Over time, it becomes self-abandonment. And the longer it goes on, the harder it is to speak up, because you've already taught them this is what you'll accept. You've become the stable presence they can always count on, but not the one they feel they need to show up fully for. The sad truth is, growth rarely happens in that kind of emotional comfort zone. If the avoidant is never challenged by the reality that their behavior has consequences, real, painful, relational consequences, then they remain exactly where they are. not out of malice, but because there's no reason to evolve, no mirror held up, no discomfort strong enough to force them to examine their walls. And while you stay in that space hoping things will get better, you're also keeping both of you stuck. People don't usually change when everything feels manageable. They change when something shakes them. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, that moment often comes when they're confronted with a loss they didn't believe would actually happen. As long as they feel the other person is always going to be there, no matter how distant, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable they are, they remain insulated from the emotional cost of their behavior. It's not because they don't care. It's because they've never been forced to feel the weight of what they're avoiding. Avoidants live in a mental world where independence feels safer than connection. They're used to managing their emotions privately, keeping people at arm's length, and shutting down when things feel intense. When their partner asks for more closeness or consistency, they often see it as pressure rather than a normal and healthy desire for intimacy. And if their partner tolerates this pattern, staying through the emotional distance, the mixed signals, the push-pull dynamic, it reinforces the belief that their way of relating works. There's no catalyst for reflection, no crisis that disrupts the status quo. But the moment the other person stops chasing, stops asking, stops waiting, everything changes. When the avoidant realizes that the person who once secure aid them feels their emotional distance is no longer there, they're suddenly left alone with something they've spent a lifetime trying to avoiding: emotional discomfort. Now they feel the silence, they notice the absence, and more importantly, they begin to understand that the connection they once held at a distance actually mattered. This isn't about playing games or using withdrawal as a tactic to provoke change. It's about what naturally happens when someone walks away, not out of anger, but out of clarity. When someone finally sees that love alone isn't enough to carry the weight of emotional one-sidedness and chooses to protect their peace instead of proving their worth. For the avoidant, this can be a profound wake-up call. Suddenly, they're confronted with the reality that their emotional walls didn't just keep them safe. They kept them alone. It's in this discomfort that growth can begin. When the person they didn't believe would leave actually does, they're forced to question the patterns they've relied on. That's when the avoidance stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like the very thing that cost them something real. And sometimes that's what it takes for real, lasting change to begin. There's a moment in every emotionally lopsided relationship where staying starts to hurt more than leaving ever could. For someone who's been in a relationship with an avoidant partner, walking away often feels like the last resort, something they resisted for as long as possible. But when it finally happens, it becomes something more powerful than they expected. It becomes the moment they choose themselves. And that decision, while painful, becomes the beginning of a different kind of love story. The one they write with their own self-worth. Leaving someone you care about deeply, especially when you've held on through so much emotional distance, isn't an act of failure. It's an act of self-respect. When you've spent so much time trying to earn connection, trying to prove that you're safe, that you won't hurt them, that you're worth opening up to, it becomes easy to lose sight of what you deserve in return. You confuse patience with love. You confuse emotional labor with loyalty. And you end up building the relationship entirely on your shoulders, waiting for them to meet you halfway. But the truth is, people don't meet you halfway until you stop doing all the walking. When you walk away, not as a manipulation, not as a punishment, but because your soul is tired, you send a message, not just to them, but to yourself. You declare that your needs matter, that you won't silence your emotions to keep someone else comfortable. That love, in its healthiest form, should feel like reciprocity, not survival. For the avoidant, this moment can be jarring. Up until now, they may have assumed you'd always be there, that you'd keep giving, keep understanding, keep waiting. But when you leave, the illusion breaks. They're forced to face a reality they didn't believe would come. And in that moment, they finally see what they were pushing away. Not just any relationship, but the right one. The one where they were safe, seen, and genuinely cared for. This doesn't guarantee they'll change, but if they ever do, it won't be because you begged them to grow. It will be because the pain of your absence taught them something your presence never could, that emotional distance has a price. Sometimes it takes losing something real to realize how real it was. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for them and for yourself is to walk away, not to hurt them, but to finally stop hurting you. So if you've been the one loving the avoidant, waiting, hoping, holding space for someone who never fully showed up, know this, it was never about being too much. You weren't asking for anything unreasonable. You were asking for reciprocity. You were offering real love, and all you wanted was to feel it back in a way that was consistent, safe, and mutual. And maybe the most heartbreaking truth is that sometimes people only see the value of what they had once it's no longer in front of them. But that doesn't mean you should have stayed longer. It doesn't mean your leaving was the mistake. In fact, it may have been the most powerful thing you could have done. Not just for them, but for you. Because real love doesn't ask you to abandon yourself. It invites both people to rise. And if one person refuses to grow, the strongest, most loving move you can make is to walk away with your dignity intact and your heart open to someone who will rise with you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being brave enough to choose your worth, even when it hurts. If no one has told you lately you were never too much, you were simply asking for the kind of love that never should require shrinking to deserve it.